I have to admit I'm a little intimidated because the prior speaker could play his own entrance music, and entrance music is key. I have a question for you. It's a question I've spent a long time studying, and that is, why do some teams outperform others? Why are some teams more innovative than others? Why are some teams more collaborative or co-creative than each other? Why are some teams more successful than others? Why is it that sometimes you can spend tons of money and try and recruit top talent and put that team up against a lesser qualified, lesser funded team, and they lose? I mean, pick your sport, right? It's a story of certain teams spending tons of money to acquire top talent and then it doesn't work out so well. As an organizational psychologist, I've been obsessed with this question for the better part of 2 decades. But as a writer, I've been lucky enough to collect the stories of some of these high-performing teams. And when you combine the research with a lot of those different experiences, you find a couple things about the way those teams operate, the way they're put together, and the way that they act that separates them out. But you also find a lot of misconceptions about what makes for great teams. For example, one of the big misconceptions, the reason we spend all sorts of money, is we assume that talent is the reason. That better teams, better performing teams are just collections of more talented individuals. But as it turns out, talent isn't portable. We've studied this time and time again. Those companies that have tons of budget to acquire top talent, when they migrate over into new organizations, you fall short. Again, pick your sport, and you can find examples of this as well. I won't name names because then I'll offend certain fans of certain athletes, but you're all thinking of at least one. Admit it. The other problem with talent, beyond it not being portable, is that it's not always an option for most leaders. I mean, go ahead, raise your hand if you could petition HR and get 25,000 euros to add onto a salary to acquire a new top talent member. Raise your hand if you could just spend that. Right. Okay. Looks like less than half. We'll go with that, less than half. So when we don't have talent to rely on, the next thing we do is we rely on another misconception. We rely on team building. We go, okay, we just need to get the team to work together better. We need to go out and go on some experience. We take an off-site. We do a ropes course, or my favorite is the one where we climb over the imaginary river on the planks. Some of you have had to do this team building exercise, right? And then we get together and we talk. We just talk. Like it's some sort of couples therapy for teams. We just talk. Or we skip the activity altogether. We skip right to the talking. But first, we take a personality test. We each fill out a bunch of questions, and then we find out our specific, unique personality type. We find out that Ron is a big D, that Sarah's number is 7 to the 4th power. Or we learn everybody's Myers-Briggs type, but we have no idea what the letters mean. My Myers-Briggs type, by the way, is NSFW. Some of you will get that later. So we try this team building thing, and what we find in the research is that while these activities feel good, they don't necessarily translate into on-the-job performance on a team. In fact, unless the team building activity, the conversation, the personality test, unless it directly affects the habits, the norms of behavior of on-site activities, these team building activities, they don't really work all that well. I like to think of it this way. Team building isn't an activity. Team building is a habit. And the highest performing teams regularly engage in this habit. But we already have a word for this habit. We don't need to use the word team building. We already have a word for it. We use the word culture. The culture of a team, the culture of the company. It's the habits and behaviors. It's the norms and activities. It's the way a team operates. It's the feeling of what it's like to being on the team. So for the last decade or so, I've been studying team cultures. And by the way, I study specifically team cultures, not company culture. Lots of people will sell you multi-million-dollar consulting packages on changing your company culture. But the average employee's experience of work is affected by the 7, 10 members on their direct team. That team's culture matters a whole lot more than what mission statement or core value statement is listed on the wall at the company entrance that nobody's gone into in the last 18 months. So if team building is an activity, it's a habit, and we need to focus on that team culture, what are we looking for? What do we build? Well, when we look at the research on high-performing teams, we find their cultures are marked by 3 elements. Sometimes more, but these 3 are always present. And so I want to draw your attention to them. Common understanding, psychological safety, and a pro-social purpose. The best teams, the highest performing teams, are marked by common understanding, psychological safety, and pro-social purpose. I'm going to define these terms for you and give you an example of how you can build them on your teams. So what is common understanding? Well, I see you trying to take pictures of the triangle. Don't worry, it's coming back. I'll bring it back. Common understanding is the extent to which members of a team have a commonly held perspective on the team's expertise, their assigned tasks, their context, their preferences. They know each other's knowledge, skills, and abilities. They know the hard stuff, like what each other's roles and responsibilities are. But they also know the soft stuff. They know how each other likes to operate. They know what requests for help actually look like versus just venting and being frustrated. They know each other's personalities. When I think about common understanding and the importance of building common understanding, I think often about Chris Hadfield. Now, you may not know the name Chris Hadfield, but I bet if I showed you a picture, you would recognize his iconic mustache, and you would recognize him lip-syncing to David Bowie songs on the International Space Station. But beyond just his viral videos filmed as an astronaut in space, Chris Hadfield is known as one of the most successful commanders of a space station mission ever. Hadfield was charged with leading 5 people from 3 very different cultures. Himself a Canadian, 2 Russian cosmonauts, and 2 Americans. So think about this culturally, right? You have 3 different cultures, you have 3 different languages, right? Russian, English, American, right? You have 3 totally different languages. And yet Hadfield saw he needed to bring everybody together in common understanding. Now, flight training, space training, it's full of checklists, it's full of roles and responsibilities. He knew that part, but he knew he needed to build the soft stuff too. And so he spent time individually and brought the team together as a group. He lived in state-funded housing with the cosmonauts. He moved in with the Americans. He had a lot of vodka with the Russians, and I guess a lot of McDonald's with the Americans. I don't really know. And he got them to understand each other better, and he got them to think about how they would respond to certain situations so they could see the differences. He even had the team role play what they would do if some member of the team found out that a loved one passed away while they were circling the Earth in that tiny little tin can, which unfortunately happened. Because one of the astronauts lost a close family member, and the only people there to comfort him were the 4 other people circling in that tin can with him. That's what I mean when I say common understanding. Okay, so how do you build common understanding? You don't have to drink a lot of vodka, eat a lot of McDonald's, or role play grieving scenarios. Although if you want to do any of those things, be my guest. How about this? How about we start simpler? How about we start with engaging your team with a regular huddle? Just a regular situation in which the team gets together, in which they circle up with each other, and in which they talk about what they just worked on, what they're focused on next, and here's my favorite question in a huddle: what's blocking my progress? You see, one of the interesting things about teams, especially lower performing teams, is that when they need help, they always go to a team leader instead of to each other. Because sometimes asking for help is seen as a negative. It's seen as I'm failing. It's seen as I don't know what to do. And we don't want to tell that to our coworkers. But often the best people to solve our problem is not our manager. I mean, we've all had that manager that was totally useless in solving any of your problems. Okay, some of you just look to your left. That's not good. You don't need to do that. You need to get the team to what I call work out loud, to broadcast out. Here's what I'm working on. Here's what I'm focused on next. Here's what I just completed. And here's what's blocking my progress. If those questions sound familiar, by the way, then you must be involved in the world of agile software development, because those are the 3 questions from the daily stand-up, a regular daily meeting that high-performing agile teams have. You don't have to do it daily, and you don't have to stand up, but you do need some way that team members can check in with each other on a regular basis. They do that, they build common understanding around the hard things first, and then they learn each other's work styles second. So we have common understanding, but high-performing teams also need a sense of psychological safety. And psychological safety is the extent to which members of a team feel safe to express themselves, to take risks, to disagree with each other, to speak up when they see something going wrong. Psychological safety, we talk a lot about the importance of having diversity on teams. Diverse teams do make better decisions than homogeneous teams. But if those diverse teams don't have a sense of psychological safety, then they're too afraid to express their differences, and in effect, you have a team that is similar anyway. So we need to build that sense of psychological safety, because when people feel free to speak up, when they disagree, or they see something going off the rails, they can save the whole team. Sometimes, when they feel free to speak up and actually admit that they need help, we can solve their problems. I think about psychological safety, and I think about the way that Alan Mulally led the turnaround of Ford in the early 2000s. Mulally was hired, one of the few CEOs of the Ford Motor Company not to have the last name Ford. And he was hired because Ford was on track that year to lose $17 billion. You remember this time, very, very rough time for most auto manufacturers, especially in the United States. Mulally knew he needed to build psychological safety and knew that the senior leadership team needed to come to an agreement about what had to be done. So he instituted a regular process every Thursday morning, what he called the business process review. And the senior leaders of the team would come and they would give a status update. And they would say, here's what's going on inside of my division. Now, if this sounds a lot like a huddle, it's because it's exactly like a huddle. It's exactly what I just described to you. It's almost like I'm doing this whole thing on purpose. Anyway, Mulally had this business process review and he asked senior leaders to color code their status report. So a green would mean everything is great. A yellow would mean, oh, we have problems, but we know how to solve them. We're still going to be able to be on track. And a red would mean something is going wrong and I have no idea what it is. And Ford, being the giant bureaucracy, the large organization with very little psychological safety, you could imagine what happened at the very first business process review meeting with the new CEO of Ford. A sea of green lights. A sea of green lights. And every week for 8 weeks, when these senior leaders would meet, they would tell the CEO, everything's great, everything's fine, we don't have any problems. Finally, in the 8th week, the CEO had to stop and go, we're on track to lose $17 billion. And you're telling me everything's fine? Surely something must be wrong. And the following week, one of the executives chose to take him up on his offer. Mark Fields was running production in a plant in Windsor, Ontario, in Canada. And they had a problem. Because of a flaw in the manufacturing process, most of the cars were coming off the lot damaged and needed to be repaired, and it was taking too long to do the repairs. So Mark took a risk, and he presented that idea in the business process review. He became the first person to switch to red and say, I have a problem. And if you're one of the other senior leaders in this meeting, you could imagine what you're thinking, right? Whew, it's the end of this guy. He's gone. We're never going to see him again. He admitted failure. But Alan Mulally took a different approach. Alan Mulally saw the red light and said, this is great, because we have a real conversation about our problems. Now we can fix them. And he stopped the entire meeting, got them focused on Mark and his production problems, and got them solved. And the next week, they ran their business process review, and not only was Mark not fired, but he had moved in the boardroom. He was sitting right next to Alan Mulally. The message sent, right? The message sent that, hey, we're not going to punish failure here. We're going to solve it. Now, guess what the slide decks and all of the lights looked like the next week? We finally had some color. We finally had people admitting their problems. Sure, there was a couple people still pretending everything's great, but most people were going to finally explain why the company was going to lose $17 billion. And because of that, they could come up with solutions to it. And when Alan Mulally resigned after a successful run turning around the Ford Motor Company, they went from losing $17 billion to a $6 to $7 billion profit. And by the way, just as a side note, do you know who Alan Mulally named as CEO when he retired? He named Mark Fields, the first executive to show a red light. That's what I mean when I say the power of psychological safety. So how do you build a sense of psychological safety on your team? What can you do to get people feeling a bit more safe to speak up, feeling a bit more free? Well, I encourage most leaders to encourage their teams to actively disagree with them, to actively encourage dissent, encourage them to speak up. Now, how do we do this? Because most of us, if we're leading teams or if we're on teams, are terrible at creating opportunities to speak up. We run the whole meeting, we present all the information, we solicit all the ideas, and then we go, okay, any comments, concerns, clarifications? Just like that, really quickly, just like that. It's sort of like the way the priest at a wedding says, speak now or forever hold your peace. You know you're not supposed to say anything, and when you say comments, concerns, they know they're not supposed to say anything. In my past life, I was a full-time business school professor, and I learned this with undergrads. I learned that I couldn't lecture for 45 minutes and then go, any questions? But what I could do is stop at regular points and say, you know, I bet I top-lined some of this information. I bet I summarized it too fast. I might have even misspoke. What questions do you have for me? It's a little linguistic flip there. Does anyone have any questions to what questions do you have for me? That's what I mean when I say actively encourage dissent. Okay, and the last element of a thriving team culture is a sense of pro-social purpose. Now, these words are very, very specific. This is the extent to which members of a team feel they're making a contribution toward work that benefits others. This isn't just purpose. This isn't just a mission statement. This is who benefits by the work that we do. And the most recent research on motivation shows that one of the most potent forms of motivation is knowing whose life is made better by the work that you do. But we often don't talk about that, right? We talk about the vision, the top level thing. We talk about growth. Growing towards what? Growth is like acceleration. Oh, great, now we're going 80 kilometers per hour. Tell me where we're going and what we're going to do when we get there. Whose lives are made better by the work that we do? I think about pro-social purpose, and I think about a recent initiative about 10 years ago that was conducted by KPMG. They're a Big Four accounting firm. At the time, they had around 30,000 employees across the globe. And let's just be real. It's accounting. It's boring, right? Any accountants in here? Raise it. Actually, don't. I mean, you might be able to make dotting I's and crossing T's and calculate numbers. You might be able to make it engaging, but it's really hard to make it feel like purposeful work when you're just auditing contracts and making sure people pay their taxes. But what KPMG did was they made sure that people knew exactly who was helped by the work that they did. And they launched this thing they called the We Shape History campaign, because they talked about the way that KPMG as a company was involved in things like the Lend-Lease Act during World War II, which was all of the contracts behind the Americans lending money, lending resources, and lending weapons to the Allies as they fought Nazi Germany. It was the first way that the United States entered the war. Do you know who managed all of those contracts? KPMG. They talked about the way that in the 1990s, South Africa, Nelson Mandela was released from prison and was elected the first black president of South Africa. Do you know who certified that election? KPMG. They made sure that when people saw posters like this one, they knew about the story of how KPMG helped the Americans recover from the tragedy that was the 9/11 attacks, because they managed the insurance efforts, the supplies, the logistics, and then they did something really cool. Then they switched from the way we shape history to the way you shape history. They launched what they called the 10,000 Stories Challenge, asking individuals to make their own poster, to submit their own story about the way that they helped farmers grow by helping them with banking and the credit system. They talked about the way that some associates helped stop cybercrime because they were involved in forensic accounting and they were in the ways to develop systems to make the world safer. At every level, they had a very clear picture of who is helped by the work that we do. And this is how you build pro-social purpose and pro-social motivation. You think about the ways in which you can connect your team with the direct beneficiaries of your work. Who is helped by the work that you do? Bring them in, whether it's customers or stakeholders or even just people elsewhere in the company who do a better job when your team does a good job. Let them know. Share with them those thank you letters, those thank you emails that you get. You don't have to make pretty posters, but you do have to let them know who's helped. When you do that, you build pro-social purpose. And when you start to build pro-social purpose along with common understanding and psychological safety, great things happen. Because these aren't just three pillars that stand alone. They interact, they intersect. The sum is more than the the individual parts. When you build common understanding and pro-social purpose, you start to attract the best people to come work for your organization. When you build common understanding and you build psychological safety, those people feel free to speak up and you get their best ideas. You get better ideas because they can speak up and dissent. And when you build psychological safety and you build pro-social purpose, the first thing you get is the slide you should all actually take a picture of. But when you build psychological safety and pro-social purpose, you get your people's best effort. Common understanding, psychological safety, and pro-social purpose. When you build them in tandem, they begin to intersect. And your team gets better and better until you find yourself leading your best team ever. Thank you all so much for having me.